On the morning of September 8, 1900, Galveston, Texas was the richest city in the state and one of the most important ports in America. By the following morning, somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 of its people were dead. It remains, more than a century later, the deadliest natural disaster in United States history, and nothing else has come close. Hurricane Katrina, in 2005, killed fewer than 2,000. The Galveston Hurricane killed, by the most conservative count, 3 times that number in a single evening. The numbers are almost impossible to hold in the mind. Galveston Island had about 37,000 residents in the city itself, closer to 44,000 across the whole island. In the space of a few hours, the storm killed at least 1 in 6 of them. 2/3 of the city's buildings were destroyed. More than 3,600 homes wiped off their lots. The water rose more than 15 feet over an island whose highest natural point stood less than 9 feet above the sea. There was, in effect, nowhere on the entire island higher than the water that came for it. The thing that makes Galveston more than a weather event, the thing that turns it from a tragedy into a story worth telling, is that it did not have to happen this way. The man whose job it was to warn the city had 9 years earlier gone on the record in print to say that the very idea of a hurricane seriously damaging Galveston was, in his words, an absurd delusion. His name was Isaac Klein, and he was not a fool. He was the chief of the local weather bureau, a trained and respected meteorologist, and he believed, along with almost everyone in the young science of American weather forecasting, that Galveston was safe. That belief was built into the walls of the city. It was the reason no seawall existed. It was the reason people stood on the beach and watched the waves come in as the storm approached, treating it as a spectacle rather than a threat. To understand how a single afternoon became the deadliest day America has ever recorded, you have to understand the city that stood in the water's way, the confidence that left it undefended, and the 12 hours in which all of it came apart. Galveston, in 1900, was a city that had every reason to feel invincible. It sat on a sandbar in the Gulf of Mexico, a barrier island about 30 miles long and, in most places, less than 2 miles wide. On that thin strip of sand, over the course of the 19th century, Texans had built the most important commercial center in the state. Its harbor was the deepest on the Texas coast, and through it flowed an enormous share of the cotton that the American South sold to the world. Galveston was the place where that cotton was weighed, priced, loaded, and shipped, and the money that moved through the port built a city that outshone anything else in Texas. It was called the Wall Street of the Southwest. It had more millionaires per capita than almost anywhere in the country. The Strand, its main commercial avenue, was lined with grand Victorian buildings, ornate 3- and 4-story structures of brick and iron that housed banks, cotton brokers, and import houses. Galveston had electric lights before most American cities. It had telephones. It had one of the first medical schools in Texas. It had streetcars and an opera house and mansions along Broadway with wide porches and manicured gardens, and it had a reputation up and down the Gulf Coast as a place of wealth and sophistication and confidence. It was also, though almost no one wanted to think about it this way, a city built at sea level on a sandbar, facing directly into the warm water of the Gulf of Mexico in the middle of hurricane country. The highest point in Galveston stood less than 9 feet above the ordinary level of the sea. The whole island was, in the language of engineers, extremely low and extremely flat, with no natural high ground anywhere. No bluff, no hill, no ridge, nothing that could serve as refuge if the water ever decided to come inland. The people of Galveston knew hurricanes. They had lived through them before. Storms had brushed the island and flooded its streets on several occasions in the decades before 1900, and each time the water had receded and the city had dried out and gone back to business. This experience, which should have been a warning, instead became a source of dangerous comfort. Galvestonians had come to view hurricanes as a nuisance, an occasional inconvenience of coastal living, something that rattled the windows and soaked the low streets and then passed. The idea that a storm could actually destroy the city, could kill people by the thousand was not part of how anyone thought. There had, in fact, been discussion of building a seawall. The neighboring town of Galveston had watched storms hit, and some residents had argued, sensibly, that a barrier along the Gulf side of the island would protect the city from the sea. But the wall was never built. It was expensive, and the prevailing scientific and civic opinion was that it was unnecessary. Worse, in the years before the storm, developers had actively made the island more vulnerable. They stripped away the natural vegetation that helped hold the dunes together, and they carted sand away from the beach dunes to fill in the low, marshy spots where they wanted to build. The natural defenses the island did have, modest as they were being dismantled in the name of real estate. At the center of the city's confidence stood Isaac Klein. Klein was the head of the Galveston office of the United States Weather Bureau, the federal agency that was, in 1900, still figuring out how to forecast the weather at all. He was a serious man, an educated man, a physician as well as a meteorologist, and he was widely respected. And in 1891, 9 years before the storm, Klein had written an article for the Galveston Daily News addressing exactly the question of whether the city needed protection from hurricanes. In it, he dismissed the notion. He wrote that it would be impossible for any cyclone to seriously damage the city, and he described the fear of such an event as an absurd delusion. He argued that the shallow slope of the seafloor near Galveston would break up any storm surge before it could reach the city, that the very geography people worried about was in fact the city's protection. He was wrong on the science, completely wrong, and his authority helped ensure that the seawall was never built. When the storm came, it would take his own family from him, and he would spend the rest of his long life studying hurricanes, driven by the thing he had failed to see. The storm that would destroy Galveston began, as these storms do, far out over warm ocean water. In the last days of August 1900, a disturbance formed in the mid-Atlantic, well east of the Caribbean. It drifted westward through the Greater Antilles, passing over the islands, and by early September it had reached Cuba. It was, at this point, not obviously a monster. The forecasters in Cuba, who had real experience with tropical storms, watched it and worried, but the American Weather Bureau in Washington held a low opinion of Cuban meteorology and had actually restricted the flow of storm warnings coming out of Havana. This was a matter of professional pride and institutional politics, and it would prove deadly. The men who best understood the storm were the men Washington had decided not to listen to. The Weather Bureau in Washington predicted that the storm, after crossing Cuba, would curve to the north and then to the northeast, sweeping up the Atlantic coast of the United States the way so many storms did. This was the expected path. It was the safe assumption, and it was wrong. Instead of curving away, the storm moved into the Gulf of Mexico, and there it found water that was unusually warm, even for the season, and it began to feed on that warmth and grow. In 1900, there was no way to see this happening. There were no satellites, no hurricane hunter aircraft, no radar, no buoys. The only information about a storm at sea came from ships that happened to encounter it, and ships in 1900 had no way to radio that information to shore. Wireless communication from ship to land did not yet exist in any practical form. A vessel that sailed into the heart of the hurricane and survived could only report what it had seen after it reached port, by which time the storm had moved on. The Gulf of Mexico, as far as the Weather Bureau was concerned, was very nearly a blind spot. A hurricane could cross it in near total silence. And so the storm approached Texas, almost unseen, gathering strength over the hot Gulf water, while the Weather Bureau's official position remained that it was a relatively minor system somewhere off the southeastern United States. The warnings that reached Galveston were vague and understated. The people of the city had no real sense that the deadliest storm in their nation's history was bearing down on them. Isaac Klein, however, began to feel that something was wrong. On the morning of September 8th, the sky over Galveston was troubling in ways that Klein, for all his earlier confidence, could read. Long, slow swells were rolling in from the southeast and breaking on the beach, heavy and rhythmic, even though the winds were still relatively light and coming from the wrong direction to explain them. To an experienced eye, those deep swells were the fingerprint of a powerful storm far out at sea, pushing the ocean ahead of it. The barometer was beginning to fall. Clouds were building. Klein would later write that if they had understood then what those swells were telling them, they would have known the terror that was coming. Klein made a decision that day that ran against his training and against the rules of his own agency. Weather Bureau protocol required local offices to get authorization from Washington before issuing certain warnings. The central office had not called for a hurricane warning at Galveston, but Klein, watching the swells and the falling barometer, became convinced that a major storm was about to strike, and he did not wait for permission. He raised the hurricane warning flags over the Weather Bureau building, and on the 7th and through the morning of the 8th, he went out personally, moving through the low-lying parts of the city and along the beach, warning people to get to higher ground. The trouble was that there was no higher ground. On an island whose highest point was less than 9 feet above the sea, telling people to seek elevation was almost a cruel joke. Some residents heeded the warning and left for the mainland while they still could, crossing the bridges that connected the island to the Texas coast. Many more did not. It was a Saturday. The warnings had come late and sounded uncertain, layered on top of years of official assurance that Galveston was safe. And in a final, terrible irony, the approaching storm drew people toward the water rather than away from it. Crowds gathered on the beach to watch the spectacular waves crashing higher and higher against the shore. Children played in the rising surf that was creeping into the streets. To many, it looked like an exciting show, not the leading edge of a catastrophe. Through the middle of the day, the water kept rising and the wind kept building. The swells that had been rolling in that morning became waves, and the waves began to reach farther and farther inland across the flat streets of the city. What made the Galveston hurricane so lethal was not primarily the wind, ferocious as it was. It was the storm surge, the dome of seawater that a hurricane pushes ahead of itself and drives up onto the land. And Galveston, low and flat and undefended, was almost perfectly designed to be drowned by it. By the afternoon, the surge was pouring across the island. The water did not come as a single wave, but as a steadily rising flood, climbing the steps of houses, filling the ground floors, rising toward the second stories. It came from the Gulf side, sweeping across the beach and into the residential districts, and because the island was so narrow and so low, there was nowhere for it to stop. The whole city was going under at once. The high water mark would eventually be measured at more than 15 feet on an island where almost nothing stood higher than 9. As the water rose, it began to take the city apart. The wooden houses that made up most of Galveston were lifted off their foundations and began to float, and then to break, and then to collide with one another. And here the storm created a weapon out of the city itself. As homes near the beach disintegrated, their wreckage, timbers, walls, roofs, furniture was pushed inland by the surge and the wind, and it accumulated into a moving wall of debris. This mass of shattered buildings acted like a battering ram, grinding forward through the city, and each house it struck added its own wreckage to the pile. Houses that might have survived the water alone were destroyed by the debris of the houses that had stood between them and the sea. Whole neighborhoods were reduced to a churning field of broken lumber riding on 15 feet of water, and anyone caught in it faced not just drowning, but being crushed and battered by the remains of their own city. The wind, meanwhile, reached speeds that the instruments could not fully record because the instruments blew away. The Weather Bureau's own anemometer was torn off the building after registering winds over 100 miles an hour, and the storm was still strengthening when it went. Modern estimates place the peak winds around 135 miles per hour or higher, a Category 4 hurricane. Slate tiles ripped from roofs became projectiles moving through the air with enough force to kill. The combination of wind and water and flying debris made being outside a death sentence and being inside only marginally safer, because the buildings themselves were coming apart. Isaac Klein had gone home to his own house, which he believed was strongly built and which had filled with dozens of neighbors seeking shelter, perhaps 50 people in all. As the water rose past the second floor, Klein and his brother Joseph, also a Weather Bureau man, watched the storm reach its peak. Around the time the wind shifted, the water surged several feet in a matter of moments, and the house gave way. It collapsed into the flood with all 50 people inside. Klein was swept into the water. He managed to save 3 of his children and, with his brother, kept them afloat on a piece of wreckage through hours of darkness, riding the debris as the storm raged around them. His wife, Cora, who was pregnant, was killed. Her body would be found weeks later, buried in wreckage near where the house had stood. The Klein's ordeal was one story among thousands, and most of the others were never fully recorded because no one survived to tell them. Entire families vanished. Visitors to the city, people who had come for business or pleasure and had no roots on the island, disappeared completely, and in some cases no one even knew they had been there to be counted among the dead. An orphanage on the beach, run by nuns, was destroyed, and nearly all of the children and the sisters caring for them were lost. 90 children and 10 nuns died at St. Mary's Orphan Asylum. The sisters had tied the children to themselves with lengths of clothesline, hoping to keep them together and safe. And when the bodies were found, the children were still bound to the women who had tried to save them. The storm reached its worst in the evening and into the night of September 8th. For hours, in the darkness, the people of Galveston who were still alive clung to whatever floated, to rooftops, to trees, to piles of debris, in water full of wreckage and bodies and nails and broken glass, in wind that made it impossible to see or hear or breathe, not knowing whether the rest of their families were alive, not knowing whether anyone would survive until morning. And then, gradually, through the small hours, the wind began to ease and the water began to fall. September 9th dawned on a scene that the survivors struggled for the rest of their lives to describe. Where a city of grand Victorian avenues had stood the day before, there was now a wasteland. Along the Gulf side of the island, where the surge had hit hardest, entire districts had simply ceased to exist, swept clean down to the sand as if they had never been there. Farther inland, an enormous ridge of debris ran across the island, a wall of shattered lumber up to 2 stories high in places, marking the point where the wall of wreckage had finally ground to a halt. It was as though the storm had bulldozed half the city into a single vast pile. 2/3 of the buildings in Galveston were gone. More than 3,600 houses had been destroyed. The survivors emerged into streets that were unrecognizable, choked with wreckage and mud and the dead. And the dead were everywhere. This was the aspect of the disaster that overwhelmed everything else in the days that followed. There were so many bodies that the ordinary machinery of death, funerals, coffins, burials, cemeteries, was completely inadequate to the scale. The survivors faced not only their own grief and shock, but a public health emergency of horrifying proportions. Thousands of bodies lying in the September heat of the Gulf Coast, decomposing, threatening disease. The first attempt at a solution was burial at sea. Crews gathered the dead, loaded them onto barges, weighted the bodies, and carried them out into the Gulf to be dropped into deep water. But the Gulf refused to keep them. Within days, the bodies began washing back onto the beaches of Galveston, returning to the island that had killed them. The sea burials had to be abandoned. What replaced them was worse, and it became one of the enduring and terrible images of the disaster. The bodies were burned. Great funeral pyres were built across the island out of the same wreckage that filled the streets, and the dead were cremated where they were found, in enormous fires that burned day and night for weeks. Men were conscripted at gunpoint into the grim work of clearing bodies from the debris and feeding the pyres, in some cases forced to handle the corpses of their own neighbors. Liquor was handed out to the work crews because the labor was otherwise unendurable. The smoke of the burning dead hung over Galveston for weeks, and the smell of it was something survivors said they could never forget. The social order of the city broke down in the immediate aftermath. With so much destroyed and so many dead, looting began almost at once as people picked through the wreckage and the bodies for money and valuables. There are accounts, some verified and some probably exaggerated in the retelling, of looters cutting fingers and ears from corpses to take rings and jewelry. Martial law was declared. Armed men, militia, and vigilantes patrolled the ruins, and in the chaos, hundreds of people accused of looting were reportedly shot. In the confusion of those days, it was not always clear who was a looter and who was simply a survivor searching the wreckage for their own family or their own possessions, and some of those shot were almost certainly innocent. The exact number of dead will never be known, and this uncertainty is itself part of the horror. The most conservative and widely cited figure is 6,000 dead in the city of Galveston. Estimates for the entire island and the surrounding coast run as high as 10 or 12,000. So many people vanished without a trace, so many visitors were unaccounted for, so many entire families were wiped out with no one left to report them missing, that a precise count was impossible from the very beginning. What is certain is that no other natural disaster in American history has killed as many people, before or since. The 1900 Galveston Hurricane killed more Americans than the Chicago fire, the San Francisco earthquake, and Hurricane Katrina combined. The world responded with aid. Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross, then in her late 70s, came to Galveston personally to direct relief efforts in one of the last great campaigns of her life. Money and supplies poured in from across the country and around the world, but relief could only address the immediate suffering. The larger question that faced the survivors was whether Galveston should exist at all. A city had been built at sea level on a sandbar, and the sea had proven in a single night that it could erase that city and kill a sixth of its population. The rational response might have been to abandon the island entirely, to accept that human beings had no business living in a place so exposed. Galveston did not abandon the island. Instead, the survivors made a decision that stands as one of the most remarkable acts of civic will in American history. They decided to stay and to make the island defensible, and they undertook two enormous engineering projects to do it. The first was the seawall that Isaac Klein had once declared unnecessary. In the years immediately after the storm, a board of engineers designed a massive curved concrete barrier to stand between the city and the Gulf. Construction began in 1902, and the first section, more than 3 miles long, was completed in 1904. The wall stood 17 feet high, measured from the low tide line, taller than the surge that had drowned the city. It was 16 feet thick at its base, built of concrete and granite and reinforced with pilings driven deep into the sand, and its curved face was designed to catch the force of an incoming wave and turn it back on itself. Over the following decades, the wall was extended again and again, until it ran for miles along the Gulf shore of the island. It weighed 40,000 pounds for every foot of its length, a barrier meant to take the blow that the city itself had taken in 1900. The second project was even more astonishing. A seawall would stop the waves, but it would not stop the city from flooding, because Galveston still sat too low. So the survivors decided to raise the island. Working in sections 1/4 of a mile square, engineers built dikes around each section, then physically lifted every structure inside it, homes, businesses, churches, and enormous public buildings, on hand-operated jack screws, holding them suspended in the air on stilts. Nearly 2,000 buildings were raised this way. Then sand dredged from the harbor, and the Gulf was pumped in as a slurry beneath the elevated buildings, filling the space underneath and raising the ground level of the entire city. Some structures were lifted by as much as 16 feet. A great domed church weighing thousands of tons was raised while services continued inside it. The grade raising went on for years, from 1903 to 1911, and by the end, the survivors had literally lifted their city up out of the reach of the sea, tilting the whole island so that it rose from the bay side up to the new seawall on the Gulf side. The engineering worked. The seawall and the raised grade have protected Galveston through storm after storm in the century since, most dramatically in 1915, when a hurricane of comparable strength to the 1900 storm struck the island. Behind its new wall and on its raised ground, Galveston survived that second storm with a fraction of the death toll. The defenses the survivors built out of grief and determination have saved the city many times over. But the seawall could not save what Galveston had been. The storm broke something in the city that no amount of concrete and sand could rebuild, and that was its position as the great port and commercial capital of Texas. The disaster made vivid, in the most brutal way possible, the danger of building on an exposed sandbar in the Gulf, and investors and shippers began to look inland for a safer place to put their money. That place was Houston, 50 miles up the coast, sheltered well away from the open sea. In the years after the storm, work accelerated on the Houston Ship Channel, a project to dredge a deep-water passage that would let ocean-going vessels reach Houston without ever exposing themselves to the open Gulf. The channel opened in 1914, and it effectively ended Galveston's reign. The cotton and the commerce and the capital that had made Galveston the Wall Street of the Southwest shifted to Houston, which grew into one of the largest cities in America, while Galveston settled into a quieter existence as a smaller town of beaches and tourism and history. There is a hard lesson buried in that shift, and it has nothing to do with weather. Galveston did not fall because it was struck by a storm. Storms strike the Gulf Coast constantly. Galveston fell because for decades it had chosen to believe it was safe when it was not, because its leading expert had put his authority behind that false comfort, because the warnings that might have helped were tangled in institutional pride and cut off by primitive technology, and because a city built at sea level had stripped away its own natural defenses in the pursuit of growth. The wealth that made Galveston great was built on a foundation that everyone could see was fragile if they had been willing to look, and almost no one was willing to look until the water was already in the streets. Isaac Klein lived until 1955. He was 55 years shy of nothing, a man who had lost his wife and his certainty in a single night and had spent the remaining half-century of his life studying the storms he had once dismissed. He became one of the country's foremost authorities on hurricanes, and he wrote about that day for the rest of his life, though he never entirely escaped the shadow of having declared, in print, that the thing which killed his family and his city could never happen. Historians have debated his role ever since, whether his last-minute warnings saved thousands, as he claimed, or whether his earlier confidence helped doom the city by ensuring it stood undefended. Both things are probably true. He was the man who warned Galveston too late, because he was also the man who had reassured it too well. Today, the seawall is a tourist attraction. People stroll along the top of it, 10 miles of it now, looking out at the same Gulf of Mexico that rose up and killed 6,000 people or more in a single evening. The beaches are clean, the seafood is good, families come for the retro charm of the old island city. Most of them have no real sense that they are standing on ground that was lifted into the air on jack screws and packed with dredged sand by people trying to make sure that what happened in 1900 could never happen again. They are walking on top of a decision, the decision of a few thousand survivors not to surrender the island to the sea, built directly over the memory of the deadliest day the country has ever known. The Galveston Hurricane still holds its terrible record. In more than 125 years, through Katrina and Camille and Maria and every other storm that has battered the American coast, nothing has killed as many people in a single stroke. It stands as the deadliest natural disaster in the history of the United States. And the strange thing about it, the thing that lingers, is how avoidable so much of it was. Not the storm itself, which no one in 1900 could have stopped, but the death toll, which grew so vast because a confident city on a sandbar had been told for years that it had nothing to fear from the sea. If this kind of story stays with you, the American places that trusted the wrong assurances until the water proved them wrong, there are more of them waiting. There is the Johnstown flood of 1889, where a private dam owned by a club of the wealthy gave way and killed more than 2,000 people in a Pennsylvania valley. There is the failure of the St. Francis Dam in California in 1928, which drowned hundreds in the dark because one engineer trusted ground that could not hold. And there is the Okeechobee Hurricane of 1928 in Florida, the second deadliest storm in American history, whose victims were mostly poor laborers the warnings never reached. Tell us which one to walk into next before the water comes.